In the third week of February 1981, a farmer named Orville Steck drove a drainage tile machine across a snow-covered field in Wayne County, Iowa, while his neighbor, Pete Loomis, watched from the road. Pete had stopped his truck. He had rolled down the window. He had looked at Orville on the tile machine in the February snow, and he had said, loudly enough to be heard across the field edge, "Orville, what in the hell are you doing?" Orville had stopped the machine. He had said, "Tiling." Pete had said, "In February." Orville had said, "The ground's frozen hard enough to support the machine and soft enough to cut below the frost line on the south-facing slope." He had paused. "I've been waiting for this window for 3 years." Pete had looked at the snow on the field. He had looked at Orville. He had said, "The county agent said those fields won't be workable until June. This spring's going to be the wettest in 30 years. Orville had said, "I know. That's why I'm tiling in February." Pete had rolled up his window and driven away. The Wayne County spring of 1981 was, in fact, the wettest planting season in 31 years. The snow had been deep, the ground had been saturated from a wet fall, and the March and April rains had kept most of Wayne County out of the fields until late May. The county agent had been correct. The average planting date for Orville's township that year was May 29th. Orville Steck had been in the ground on April 28th. Not on all his fields. On the 160 acres he had tiled across the previous 3 winters. The February work, the December work before that, the October work the year before that. Those fields had drained. The snowmelt had moved through the tile lines and off the fields. The April rains had done the same. By April 24th, Orville's tiled fields had reached workable moisture content, while the rest of the township sat under standing water or saturated soil that would not carry equipment weight for another month. He had planted 160 acres in 4 days, April 24th through April 28th. He had spent May watching his neighbors wait. Let me tell you about the 3 winters that produced the April 28th planting date, because the February tile work was the last chapter of a 3-chapter story, and the earlier chapters are where the decision was made. Orville had been farming 240 acres of Wayne County ground since 1967. He had bought the farm from his father at a modest price with a land contract that had been paid off by 1972. By the mid-1970s, he was farming 240 acres debt-free, running a corn-soybean rotation and paying close attention to the one limitation on his operation that he could not manage away with better seed or better inputs or better equipment: water. The Wayne County ground Orville farmed had a drainage problem that was structural rather than circumstantial. The fields were heavy clay on a gentle north-south slope with a drainage pan about 30 inches down that prevented water from moving vertically. Water that fell on those fields stayed on those fields. In a wet year, that meant late planting. In a very wet year, it meant standing water through May. In a catastrophically wet year, and Orville had seen 2 of those in his first 12 years on the ground, it meant fields that did not get planted at all. He had been reading about subsurface drainage since 1975. Not casually, systematically, the same way Wesley Pruitt had read about winter wheat, or Cecil Briggs had read about engine rebuilds. He had read Iowa State Extension publications on tile spacing and installation depth for clay soils. He had read research on the relationship between drainage and planting date in the northern Corn Belt. He had read cost-benefit analyses comparing the cost of tile installation against the long-term yield benefit of earlier planting dates. He had concluded in 1977 that his fields needed tile drainage and that the cost of the tile was justified by the yield benefit over a 12-year payback period. He had calculated the tile spacing his clay soil required for effective drainage, 40-foot spacing at 30 to 36 inches of depth, running to a natural drainage outlet along the east field edge. He had not been able to do it all at once. The tile machine cost, the pipe cost, and the labor cost across 160 acres of tile installation at 40-foot spacing was more than his operating account could absorb in a single year. He had planned a 3-year installation program. Year 1, fall of 1978. 60 acres tiled in October, the west field with the lowest natural drainage outlet access, cost $4,200. Year 2, fall of 1979 and winter of 1979 to 1980. 60 more acres tiled in November and December, the central fields. Cost $4,600 including equipment rental for the frozen groundwork in December. Year 3, winter of 1980 to 1981. The remaining 40 acres of the east field, which had the most difficult drainage pattern and required a different tile layout than the first 2 installations. Orville had been waiting for the specific ground condition that made the east field tile installation feasible. Frozen hard enough to support the machine on the surface, but soft enough to cut at depth on the south-facing exposure. He had missed the window in December 1980 when the freeze had come too hard too fast. He had waited for February. The February window had arrived on the 18th. He had been in the field on the 19th. Pete Loomis had stopped his truck on the county road and said, "Orville, what in the hell are you doing?" Orville had said, "Finishing what I started in 1978. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, have you ever done field work in February or December that paid off in a spring planting? Let me tell you about the almost quit moment, because it happened in the fall of 1980, when the December installation window had closed before Orville could complete the east field tile work. He had been ready to install the east field tile in December of 1980. He had the machine rented. He had the pipe ordered and stacked at the field edge. He had the crew scheduled. Then a hard freeze had come through in late November, faster and deeper than anything the forecast had predicted, and the ground had frozen to 18 inches in 4 days. Too hard for the tile machine to cut at depth on the east field's north-facing slope. He had lost the window. The pipe had been returned to the supplier. The machine had been returned to the rental company. The east field had gone through the winter of 1980 to 1981 without tile. The forecast for the 1981 spring had been available from the Iowa State climatologist's office by January, a strong La Niña pattern that historically correlated with wet springs in southern Iowa. Orville had read the climatological analysis. The probability of a wet spring, based on the La Niña indicator, was higher than 70%. He had thought, if this spring is wet and the east field is not tiled, I will lose planting days on 40 acres of my best ground. He had thought about this for 2 weeks. He had thought about whether to try to get the east field tiled in February, an unconventional time for tile installation requiring specific ground conditions, or to wait for fall of 1981 and accept the risk of the wet spring on the east field. He had decided to wait for the February window. He had kept the pipe at the field edge through the winter. He had watched the weather. He had waited for the specific condition: frozen hard on the surface, cuttable at depth on the south exposure. It had arrived on February 18th. He had been in the field the following morning. Pete had called the county agent after stopping on the road to watch Orville tile in February. The county agent had called Orville. He had said, "Orville, I'm hearing you're tiling in February." Orville had said, "Yes." The agent had said, "The conventional window for tile installation is October through early December before hard freeze." Orville had said, "I know." He had said, "The south-facing slope on the east field holds enough heat to stay cuttable below the frost line in February if the surface is frozen. It's a narrow window. I've been waiting for it since December." The agent had been quiet. He had said, "You've studied this." Orville had said, 3 years. The agent had said, "I'd be interested in the results." Orville had said, "Call me in October." The agent had called in October. Orville had told him 160 tiled acres planted April 24th to 28th. 80 untilled acres planted May 28th. Yield difference: 31 bushels per acre in favor of the tiled ground. 3-year tile investment, $12,400 total. First-year yield premium on the tiled ground, 31 bushels per acre times 160 acres times $2.90 per bushel equals $14,384. The tile had paid for its entire 3-year installation cost in the first year it was fully in the ground. The agent had said, "That's the best return on tile installation I've seen documented." Orville had said, "It's because the spring was as wet as the La Niña forecast predicted." He had said, "A normal spring would have shown maybe 12 to 15 bushels per acre advantage on the tiled ground." He had said, "The wet spring made it dramatic." He had paused. "But even at 12 bushels per acre, the tile pays in 3 or 4 years." The county agent had used Orville's numbers in an extension presentation that fall. Orville was not named. The agent had asked, and Orville had declined. The methodology and the results were in the presentation. Let me tell you about Pete Loomis, because Pete stopped on the road in February and said what he said and deserves a fair accounting. Pete had been farming Wayne County ground for 22 years in 1981. He was a careful farmer who maintained his equipment well and managed his inputs correctly and produced yields that were consistently near or slightly above the county average. He was not a bad farmer. He was a farmer who had not read the Iowa State drainage research and had not spent 3 winters building the infrastructure that the 1981 spring would test. He had stopped on the road in February because a man tiling in February was unusual enough to warrant stopping. He had said what he said, "What in the hell are you doing?" because Orville tiling in February in the snow looked like poor judgment to someone who did not know that Orville had been planning this specific window for 3 years. He had called the county agent not from malice, but from the genuine belief that Orville might be damaging his fields with ill-timed installation. In October of 1981, at the Wayne County elevator, Pete had heard Orville's planting date and yield results discussed among the farmers there. He had done the math in his own head. 160 acres at 31 bushels more per acre than the county average was a large number. He had gone to Orville at the elevator. He had said, "Orville, I heard your tiled ground did 31 bushels over county average this year." Orville had said, "Tiled and planted April 28th. County planted May 29th. That's 31 days of yield drag difference. Pete had said, "I watched you tile in February in the snow, and I thought you'd lost your mind." Orville had said, "I know." Pete had said, "You'd been planning that for 3 years." Orville had said 1978 was the first installation. 1979, 1980, February, 1981. Pete had said, and the wet spring made it all pay at once. Orville had said, the wet spring made it visible all at once. He had paused. The tile would have paid in a normal spring, too, just over 3 or 4 years instead of 1. Pete had said, I should have tiled in 1978. Orville had said, probably. He had paused. The La Niña analysis in January. You could have read that in January. Pete had looked at his truck. He had said, I don't read the Iowa State climatology reports. Orville had said, I do. He had said it without boasting, as a statement of practice. He read the climatology reports. He read the drainage research. He had been reading them since 1975. That reading had told him to start tiling in 1978. The 3-year installation program had been completed in February of 1981. The 1981 spring had done what La Niña correlated springs in southern Iowa do. Orville had been ready. Pete had not been ready through no fault of character, through the simple absence of the reading that would have told him to be. Orville had been in the ground on April 28th. Pete had been in the ground on May 29th. The difference was 31 days of yield drag and 31 bushels per acre and $14,384 in a single season on 160 acres. The county said the fields would not be workable until June. Orville's had been workable on April 24th. The county was right about Pete's fields. Orville's fields were different from Pete's fields not because of the county's prediction, but because of what Orville had done to them in October 1978, December 1979, and February 1981. The man who tiles his fields in February in the snow is not doing something foolish. He is finishing something he started 3 years ago that is going to determine what April looks like. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, what infrastructure work have you done on your farm in winter that determined what your spring looked like? The county said June. Orville said April 28th. The tile said April 28th was right. Let me tell you about what the tile system actually does, because Pete Loomis stopped on the road and saw a man tiling in February in the snow and did not understand what he was looking at. Understanding what the tile does explains why Orville had been waiting for 3 years for the February window. Subsurface drainage tile, perforated plastic pipe in 1981, clay tile in earlier decades, is installed at a depth of 30 to 36 inches in heavy clay soils, running at a slight grade toward a natural outlet. Water that enters the soil from above, whether from rain or snowmelt, moves laterally through the soil matrix, toward the tile lines, and then through the tile to the outlet. The tile does not prevent water from entering the soil. It removes water from the root zone faster than the natural drainage capacity of the undrained clay soil. In a wet spring on undrained heavy clay ground, the root zone stays saturated for 6 to 8 weeks longer than it would on tile-drained ground. Saturated soil is not workable. Equipment running on saturated soil causes compaction damage, and seeds placed in saturated soil do not germinate correctly. The practical consequence is that undrained clay ground in a wet spring cannot be planted until 6 to 8 weeks after the first feasible planting date on adjacent tile-drained ground. In a normal spring, tile-drained ground might be workable 1 to 2 weeks earlier than undrained ground, a real but modest advantage. In an exceptional spring, a La Niña spring, a spring with heavy snowpack and wet March and April rains, tile-drained ground might be workable 4 to 6 weeks earlier than undrained ground. The worse the spring, the larger the advantage. Orville had understood this from the Iowa State research he had been reading since 1975. He had understood that the tile system's value was not constant. It scaled with spring wetness, paying more in wet years and less in dry years. He had understood that a single, very wet year could repay the entire installation cost. He had not planned his installation program around the expectation of a very wet year. He had planned it around the expectation that the tile would pay in a normal year over 3 to 4 years, and that a very wet year was possible and would accelerate the payback. The La Niña forecast in January of 1981 had suggested a very wet year was more probable than usual. That had sharpened his urgency around completing the East Field installation before spring. Pete Loomis had stopped on the road and seen a man in the snow with a tile machine. He had not seen the 6 years of reading and calculating and planning that the man in the snow was expressing with the tile machine. This is the pattern. What looks improvised or reckless from the road is often the final visible expression of years of invisible preparation. The February tile work was visible. The 6 years of research and planning behind it were not. Let me tell you about what Orville's 240 acres looked like by 1985, 4 years after the full tile system was in, because the full accounting of what the tile produced over multiple years is the argument that Pete eventually came to accept. By 1985, Orville had 4 years of data comparing his tiled 160 acres to his untiled 80 acres. He had kept careful records, planting dates, yield by field, spring moisture conditions. The data showed a consistent pattern regardless of spring conditions. In a normal spring, 1982-1983, the tiled ground was workable approximately 10 days earlier than the untiled ground. The yield advantage was 8 to 11 bushels per acre in favor of the tiled ground. In a wet spring, 1984, similar conditions to 1981 but less extreme, the tiled ground was workable approximately 25 days earlier. Yield advantage, 22 bushels per acre. The exceptional 1981 spring had been the extreme case. 31 days earlier, 31 bushels per acre advantage. The typical case was 10 to 11 days earlier and 8 to 11 bushels per acre. Still real and consistent advantage. Orville had tiled the remaining 80 acres in the fall of 1983, using the revenue from the 1981 yield premium to fund the additional installation. By 1984, all 240 acres were tiled. The farm's average planting date was consistently 10 to 25 days earlier than the Wayne County average, depending on spring conditions. The farm's average yield was consistently above the county average by a margin that the earlier planting dates explained in significant part. By 1985, Pete Loomis had tiled 80 of his own acres, following Orville's model. He had asked Orville's advice on tile spacing and installation depth for his specific soil type. Orville had given it freely. Pete had installed 80 acres of tile in 2 seasons and had seen results consistent with what Orville had described. Pete had said, in the fall of 1985, at the elevator, "Orville, I watched you tile in February in the snow in 1981, and I thought you were wrong." He had paused. "I should have started in 1978. Orville had said, "You're starting in 1984. Better than 1988. Pete had said, "How did you know to start in 1978? Orville had said, "I read the Iowa State drainage publications in 1975 and did the cost-benefit calculation." He had paused. The calculation said it paid. "I started in 1978. Pete had said, "I didn't know those publications existed." Orville had said, "The Extension Office has them." He had looked at Pete. He had said, "Everything I knew about tiling was in those publications." I didn't discover anything. I just read what Iowa State had already figured out. This is the thing. The knowledge that told Orville to start tiling in 1978 was not secret knowledge. It was Iowa State Extension publications available to every Wayne County farmer. Pete had not read them. Orville had. The difference in their 1981 planting dates, April 28th versus May 29th, was the difference between reading the publications and not reading them. Pete was not a bad farmer. He was a good farmer who had not read the right publications in 1975. By 1984, he had read them and started acting on them. He was on a different schedule than Orville, but on the same path. Orville said, "I didn't discover anything. I just read what Iowa State had already figured out." That is the honest answer. The February tile work in the snow was not inspiration or stubbornness or unusual insight. It was the consequence of reading what Iowa State had figured out in 1975 and acting on it systematically across 3 winters. The county said the fields would not be workable until June. Iowa State had said in 1975 that tile drainage could make wet year fields workable 4 to 6 weeks earlier. Orville had read Iowa State. April 28th was in the ground when Pete was still waiting for May. The publications were available to both of them. Only one of them had read them. Let me tell you about the February window itself. The specific 2-week period in February 1981 that Orville had been waiting for, because the window is the hinge on which the whole story turns, and understanding it explains why Pete's question was not as foolish as Orville's answer might have suggested. In Wayne County, Iowa, the February ground is complex. The surface is frozen. Typically 12 to 18 inches of frost depth by mid-February in a normal winter. And in 1981, after the heavy snowpack, the frost had driven to 24 inches on north-facing slopes. A tile machine running on this surface would be supported by the frozen crust. But cutting at the required depth, 30 to 36 inches, meant cutting below the frost line into soil that was cold, but not frozen. This distinction, frozen crust supporting the machine, unfrozen soil available for cutting below, was not universal across the field. On north-facing slopes, the frost had gone deep, and cutting to 36 inches would require cutting through frozen soil, which was damaging to the tile machine's cutting head and inconsistent in its depth control. On south-facing slopes, the combination of solar exposure and the insulating snow cover had kept the frost shallower, 14 to 16 inches, while keeping the surface firm enough to support the machine. The east field on Orville's farm had a south-facing exposure across approximately 60% of its area. This was the 60% where the February installation was feasible. The remaining 40%, on a north-facing slope, would have required waiting for spring thaw. Orville had mapped this in his head across 3 years of watching the east field's seasonal behavior. He knew the south-facing portion. He knew the frost depth pattern. He knew that when the surface temperature stayed below 25 degrees for 5 consecutive days after a recent thaw, the surface was frozen enough to support the machine while the depth remained cuttable. February 18, 1981, had met those conditions. The 5 consecutive cold days had followed a brief thaw in the second week of February. Orville had walked the south-facing portion of the east field on the 17th, pushing a steel rod into the ground at 10-point intervals to measure frost depth. 14 to 16 inches consistently on the south face. He had checked the soil at 30 inches depth by augering a test hole, unfrozen, cold, cuttable. He had called the tile machine rental company that evening and reserved the machine for February 19th. Pete had stopped on the road on February 19th and said, "What in the hell are you doing?" The answer was, completing a 3-year installation program on a south-facing slope where the specific February ground conditions made installation possible, using knowledge of this field's seasonal behavior accumulated across 12 years of farming it. It was not a short answer. Orville had said, tiling. He had said, "I've been waiting for this window for 3 years. That was the short version of the long answer. The long version was everything above. Pete had not had time for the long version. He had rolled up his window and driven away. He had come to understand the long version over the following 4 years as he watched Orville's yields, and then asked Orville's advice, and then tiled his own ground following Orville's model. He had said in 1985, "I should have started in 1978. Orville had said, "You're starting in 1984. Better than 1988. That is the right frame. Not should have started in 1978. Starting in 1984, which was better than 1988, which was better than never." Pete had been watching the right thing from the road on February 19, 1981. He had just not known yet what he was watching. He figured it out. He read the publications. He tiled his ground. His planting dates moved earlier. His yields moved up. The pattern played out for Pete the same way it had played out for Orville 4 years later, and without the benefit of the exceptional 1981 spring to make the payback dramatic and immediate. Pete did not have an April 28th planting date in 1981 or in 1982 or in 1983. He did not have Orville's 1981 yield premium of $14,384. He paid those 3 years of missing the tiles benefit without knowing he was paying them. The same way every farmer who does not read the publications pays for not reading them, in the form of outcomes that were available but not taken because the knowledge was not there. He read the publications in 1983. He started tiling in 1984. By 1988, his planting dates were tracking similarly to Orville's. By 1992, his cumulative yield premium from the tiled ground had exceeded the cumulative installation cost. He had recovered the 4 years he had missed. He could not recover 1981. He recovered everything after 1984. Orville had said, better than 1988. He meant starting in 1984 meant Pete recovered by 1992 rather than by 1996. Earlier is always better, within the constraint of the knowledge and the resources available when the decision is made. Pete had not had the knowledge in 1978. He had the knowledge in 1984. He used it when he had it. That is what good farmers do. Orville had had the knowledge in 1975. He had used it in 1978. That is also what good farmers do. The county agent's prediction, workable until June, had been correct for Pete's undrained fields. It had been incorrect for Orville's drained fields. The prediction was calibrated to the county average. Orville's fields were not average. He had made them not average across 3 winters of work. The county said June. Orville said April 28th. He was already in the ground when June arrived. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. The publications were available in 1975. Everything Orville knew was in those publications. The February window, the soil conditions on the south-facing slope, the La Niña analysis, the yield premium calculations, all of it was available to every Wayne County farmer who went to the Extension office and asked for the drainage publications. Most did not ask. Orville asked in 1975. He started tiling in 1978. He finished in February 1981. He planted April 28th. Pete asked in 1983. He started tiling in 1984. He finished in 1986. He planted earlier. The publications were the same publications. The knowledge was the same knowledge. The difference was when each man read it. Orville read it in 1975, April 28th, 1981. The county said June. The tile said April 28th was right.